Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and start. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our speaker, but I wanted to officially welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are the North Carolina branch of the International Dyslexia Association, and this is one in a series of coffee chats. We encourage you to, if you haven't seen some of our past ones, you can go to our website for recordings of those. Our website is nc.dyslexiaida.org. You can see past recordings. In a few days, you will see a recording of this. There was also a dyslexia awareness calendar there with resources for every day of this month. This month is dyslexia awareness. So I encourage you to utilize that calendar and share with your colleagues. And you will also see information about our next coffee chat this coming Monday, October 12th, with Candy Sellers, a fellow in the Academy, talking about syllables as part of phonics instruction. I also wanted you to see on the screen the bit link for resources and a note-taking guide for today's session. I believe that has also been copied into the chat portion of this webinar. Let's see, one other, if you are not already following us on Instagram, I encourage you to do that as well. It's IDA_NOR for North Carolina and then CAR. So IDA_NOR CAR. You will be kept in the loop about upcoming coffee chats and events that we have going on this month and the rest of the year. But now I would like to introduce you to our speaker for today, Dr. Elsa Cardenas-Hagan. She is a bilingual speech and language pathologist and a certified academic language therapist. She is the director of Valley Speech, Language, and Learning Center in Brownsville, Texas. She works with the Texas Institute for Measurement, Evaluation, and Statistics at the University of Houston and is the author of Esperanza Hope, a Spanish language program designed to assist students who struggle with learning to read. Her research interests include the development of early reading assessments for Spanish-speaking students and the development of reading interventions for bilingual students. She serves as the vice president for the International Dyslexia Association and has authored curricular programs, book chapters, and journal articles on literacy development for English language learners. What a mouthful. I'm sure you teach it better than I'm speaking right now. So what a wealth of knowledge and expertise you bring to this subject. Thank you for taking the time today, and I'll let you take the floor.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to share some information that could be helpful in speaking about accommodations.
Right, so Elsa, my name is Lynn Loser, and I'm going to be having a conversation with Elsa today about this topic that's very important, I think, an often misunderstood topic. One of our board members, Sarah Gray Horn, had the opportunity to listen to her presentation for the Embrace Dyslexia series and felt that this would be really helpful to our folks in North Carolina. So we will now, Elsa, if you can talk to us about, I think we use the term modifications and we use the term accommodations. And I think those are often used interchangeably, but they're really quite different. Can you help us understand the difference between those? And let's just start with accommodations. What is an accommodation?
Thank you for asking, and you're right about the confusion regarding accommodation versus modification. So I'll start with an accommodation. And so this is, you think about to accommodate something. It's an adjustment. And it's an adjustment that needs to be made for students with dyslexia or other related disorders so that they can have the freedom to demonstrate their knowledge, the best opportunity to share their knowledge. And it means, notice, without lowering the learning or the performance expectations, and without changing what is being measured. In other words, we still have the same expectations, right? But we have some different ways in which, they might demonstrate those.
Yeah, so I often think about that as being leveling the playing field,
Yes.
giving them equitable access to the same standards that all students have access to, so that they're really kind of not doubly disabled by their disability, doubly disabling them, and them being able to access the information, also show us what they know.
And it's exactly what you're saying, because without these accommodations, then it's not fair. It is equalizing the playing field. It's not accurately measuring their talents, their knowledge, and their skills. If I were to give an accommodation, so, there's been studies that have demonstrated that, if I give someone that has, for example, dyslexia, and another person that does not have dyslexia, and I give the accommodation, then that only helps that person that doesn't have dyslexia. And but for the student with dyslexia, it just equalizes what really is rightfully theirs. And I think that is so important. And also knowing where can this happen? It can happen in the classroom when they're demonstrating their learning, and it can happen when you're being measured, those test accommodations. And so that's important. And I know that you asked me, in particular, you were thinking about like who was eligible for, and I think that's also an issue in regards to who is eligible for these. And so it's oftentimes they might think of, well, student with dyslexia who is serviced under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act can they receive accommodations? And the answer to that is yes, very definitely. And so sometimes, folks think, well, no, you have to be identified with a student with a specific learning disability, and you have to be serviced under special education to receive these accommodations. But accommodations are actually covered under not only the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right? But also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. I know that where we live, the majority of students with dyslexia get serviced under Section 504. And there's other students with dyslexia that would be serviced under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. But, both of these major legislative initiatives cover accommodations, as well as when we think about the workforce, right? And we think about the Americans with Disabilities Act also, can cover accommodations as, especially specifically in that workforce.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to remember, because it's so important as students get older that they can advocate for themselves in college courses, advocate for themselves in their workplace. So they really have to have ownership of those accommodations, have a voice in those accommodations.
Right.
You're right, it absolutely does. The Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits that discrimination.
And I know you brought up, as we were having discussions about this coffee chat, you brought up about how important it was to really understand, I think you're talking about being able to advocate for yourself, but to be able to advocate for yourself, you have to know yourself and know what works. And who's going to help us along that journey? It's really, and I talk about, the family, the individual with dyslexia, and all the, key personnel in the schools. And, we know that there's all different types of accommodations. And, how do we know what's going to work best? And I think you mentioned, and this is not, I know everybody is pressed for time, but we should not just have a checklist and, I think that'll work and that will work and that will work. But no, we have to see Are we sure it will work? Can we get information before we make all these decisions? Can we try them out? Can we engage with our student and with the individual with dyslexia to figure out about, well, what are these types of accommodations? And hey, let's try some of these, and let's, just like we do when we remediate, when we intervene for reading difficulties, the same thing for accommodations. We should investigate, we should try them out, right? And test them and practice them and explicitly teach them and see what works. And before we just, yeah, I think this will work, I think this will work. That's not how, I don't think that's, a good plan. And so we do want to know about, well, what are the possibilities, and what are those different type of accommodations, and which ones will work for me? Is it that I need an accommodation during the presentation of information to me as an individual that struggles with reading or literacy or other disabilities, or is it in how I respond? And what about the setting, within, both the setting for, in the classroom, and then what about the setting for the testing, or you're mentioning even in the work setting, and the timing, the scheduling, do I, need extra time? These are the different types of accommodations. And so, it's very important to really understand yourself as the individual with these difficulties, but also for others that are, assisting in this process to understand you better, and for that to be just a bi-directional communication and a bi-directional investigation. Is it that, when things are presented to me, I understand, and I always tell teachers, make sure that when you give directions that I do say my 3 C's: clear, complete, and concise, right? And are we sure that they're clear, complete, and concise to our user, the end user, the individual with dyslexia, or the student with dyslexia or other related disorders? Or is it that the student requires, the individual requires some repetition, or some rephrasing, or maybe some visual kind of prompts? Maybe the larger print would be helpful. Maybe alternative answer sheets. Maybe actually presenting the information through music. In speech pathology, we call that melodic intonation therapy. Remember having to learn all the states and their capitals? I learned them through singing. And so this kind of information, what works best. But I loved when we were having these discussions, you very clearly said, we need to make sure that we're testing them and teaching them. So I thank you for that, and you're absolutely right. And when they're testing, well, even if you gave me a calculator, am I sure I know how to use it? Or if I'm taking calculus or those kind of formulas in there. You gave me the opportunity for speech to text software, but how does it work? And have I had practice to be really proficient with how that works? Did you teach me how to use Dragon Speak? Or did you teach me on the text to speech how to use the Kurzweil? Or did you teach me how to use those electronic dictionaries by Webster or Collins? And what about the spell checker, or maybe by the Franklin Speller or Grammarly? All of this, this presentation accommodation and this testing accommodation, whatever it is, you've got to teach me, and I've got to become proficient at it for it to benefit me as the user. So I think that's important. And then, how I can tell you, let me tell you as the student, what works best for me, or this is what I think works best for me. Let's try it out. But that's so very important. Oh, I think it works better if I actually record my responses on this electronic pen, or I think it's best if I use a keyboard. So the student, telling us those presentation modes. I think that's so important. And then the student telling us, I've had some students say, did you know that I work best and can concentrate best when there's music in the background? And I'm like, oh, I hardly believe that. Okay, well, let's try it. Well, sure enough, you're right. You were able to focus more with just, low tone of music there. I would have never imagined that. But that's the student giving you information as someone that's helping to make these decisions about the best accommodations. It's a two-way street. And so, sometimes we say, oh no, distraction free. but here they're telling you, no, I need a little bit of noise back there to focus.
Kind of that white noise to kind of block out other distractions. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, I'm sure you've got some suggestions too, just about this is what I like, this is what works best with me, or I work better in a small group, but it only can be one other person. When you have two or more, if you have three persons, I can't do it. Or, you know what, it doesn't work for me. I know you say I also have attention and you want to put me in the very front, but I'm more distracted about what's going on behind me. So put me in the back of the room. I'm like, well, let's check that out. So we've got to listen. We've got to listen to our individuals, and then we try it out, just like what you were saying. Because if you don't, then I mean, who knows? And we hope that they know themselves best. But you know, it's worth trying. It's worth trying these kinds of different accommodations, whether that be on the response, the presentation, the response, the setting. Another type would be the timing, whether you get extended time, right? Or you need frequent breaks. Well, you know, this is the kind of break I need, and this is all I need for the break. I just need to get up and stretch, or no, I need to walk around, or no, I need to go out and then come in, you know. So getting that, and who knows themselves better than the individual that we're trying to represent. And so I always think it should be collaboration, very good collaboration, and yeah, so.
Yeah, so I think this is an area that we often forget about. We really focus on kind of the academics, but we don't think about some of those executive functioning skills that we might need to support. And again, I think this is a place where we forget to teach these skills. So talk about these. I think these are really important for us to know and understand and think about.
Can I just tell you, I will be totally honest with you. I will tell you, it is my students that are often teaching me, oh, look, this is, you know, this is the app I got to help me do this. Or look, this helps me to keep time, and and this is how I work. And I gave an example when I did the Embrace Dyslexia. I was in Utah giving a presentation, and they had a lunch break, and the students got up there and they actually showed, you know, and demonstrated. They did this whole video, like this whole media presentation about themselves and how they introduce themselves to their teachers and the things that they've learned about themselves, what works and what doesn't. It's all about their accommodations that they were needing. But what was so fascinating, I went back to ask them, now tell me more about how that helped you, and tell me about that app. But I learned from them. So these individuals really keep up. You know, this is, you know, I put here on my iPhone this timer and it helps me do this. This is a planner for my tracking. They tell you because they keep up with all the technology. It's fascinating. But these
life skills they'll take with them once they leave school that we all use, and we're not trying to give the kids a leg up, and I think sometimes they're misunderstood that we're giving children an advantage. No, we're trying to level the playing field, give them those life skills that are going to allow them to be successful in school, at work, and at home.
And you know, it's getting more and more difficult as somebody that has to always, you know, help in this, you know, advocacy for these students, but it's, you know, there's been some misuse of these accommodations and that kind of thing. And you know, so, you know, all of this has to be very well documented. And so that is, you know, by what you were describing of us really working through and figuring this out, that's great documentation. And it's also great documentation as they go through. And you were mentioning about getting into higher education and getting into the workforce. When we have great documentation of these are the things that we've learned, these are things that help, that's just wonderful to carry that on through, you know, higher ed and then on into the workforce. So I think that's important. But through it all, like you're saying, you know, we are advocates, but the individual themselves learn to become an advocate, and that's, you know, about what works, and that and how we can. This is, you know, once again, collaboration, and so. You know, working together. And as we work together, you know, the individual becomes more self-aware and you know, when you can begin to communicate, this is what works for me. And this is my profile. This is me, right? And this is what I need to learn. That's so very important. And of course, it's going to be input from all the stakeholders, but the number one stakeholder is that individual themselves, and we need to bring them forward and highlight them and be good listeners and be good teachers as we think about what will work best. Be good parents, be good listeners, and don't think that we know it all. They teach us. They teach us as well. And I do want to get that message across.
And I think you brought up the family too. I think oftentimes the family has some really good suggestions and things that they've observed at home, and we really be getting their input too. I wonder if at this point we've talked a lot about it. Yeah, there you go. We're right in sync. This would be a good time to kind of talk about the difference between an accommodation and a modification.
Yeah, so this kind of has too much information here, but I wanted to have my own notes in front of me. But the main thing I would like to say about modification is this is where you need to be aware that the modification is actually changing the nature of the instruction or the nature of the assessment. It changes the expectations. These are the expectations of what they have to learn. So in other words, an instructional modification would be, well, they're going to do math and they're going to do math homework, and but we're going to lower that level of math skill. And we're working on fractions right now, but we're modifying for this individual who will now do multiplication, and we're not going to be doing fractions. So that is something to be very well aware of, that an accommodation is that adjustment, but the modification is actually changing the expectation, what is going to be required. And so and the same thing goes, that's not only in the instruction, but could also be in the assessment, right? This was an assessment for math and math facts accuracy. But we're going to use the calculator. So the calculator is really modifying that expectation. So modifications are allowed. They're allowed in testing and they're allowed in instruction. But what you need to know is it is modifying, it is changing that expectation. And I think that's the big difference between an accommodation and modifications.
Yeah, I think it's really important to proceed with caution with modifications and understand the long-term consequences of making those changes in what you're expecting the student to know and be able to do. Not that they can't be used or shouldn't be used, but I just think that's something that really needs to be well thought out and thinking about it long range. Because I don't know, like in our state, unless they're on alternate achievement standards, which are really geared towards 1% of our students with disability, they're still tested at the end of the year on the same standards as everybody. If we're changing those standards throughout the year and lowering the level of the standard that they're working on, that's really putting them at a disadvantage in keeping up with those grade level standards. And at least for special education, the goal is, what specially designed instruction is defined as, to give access to grade level standards. So I just think that's something that we just need to really be thoughtful about when we determine modifications.
Absolutely. And I think you asked me also some of the things that family members can do to be supportive in the home. And I wanted to touch before we run out of time, but I did want to say that, sometimes some of these students are amazing. I've seen this at home when the parent comes and says, look, here were the notes for, anatomy, or here were the notes for social studies. And the child or the individual drew and had this beautiful artwork and could retell from that artwork, or what it really helped when the individual had to write it out again or type it out again, or it really helped when they had to verbalize it back to me. And so I think as family members, you know, in the home, trying to implement and trying to carry on what that accommodation would be, I think is very important. And being a good listener to your, you know, loved one in the family, and being supportive, and being, most important, having that a routine, and building that routine, and then also making sure that you're trying to implement you know, these good skills. And then you also are part of that teaching for advocacy to really help you know, your family member become more able to express you know, what they know will work for them. And so here are just, you know, a few things that could be helpful, such as having, you know, their own materials, having organized, having a desk. Sometimes the students will say, well, I do better just sitting in my bed. And I'm like, okay, prove it to me. But they always prove me wrong. But, you know, so we do have to be good listeners in that way. And I know moms and dads probably don't want to hear that, but sometimes we do have to listen and say, okay, I'm going to give you a chance. Let's see if it's true. So these are just a few little things that we could get in here that could hopefully help those study strategies. And, you know, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about maybe some resources that could help family members or individuals who, you know, have the need for an accommodation. And, you know, there's the National Center for Learning Disabilities, NCLD, and understood.org has accommodations and what works. And the testing accommodations, if you're looking at through the lens of Americans with Disability Act. And then I was thinking about especially this forum on accommodations in the 21st century, the critical considerations for students with disabilities, and it was a joint publication of the National Center for Educational Outcomes. But also, you know, we are IDA. And so IDA has some beautiful fact sheets on accommodations for students with dyslexia, that, you know, challenge of applying for accommodations on graduate school entrance test and graduate school entrance exams. Also how to advocate for assistive technology tools and services. And there's also a group called AHEAD. So as your loved one moves into higher education, that's the Association for Higher Education and Disabilities. And that's also, you know, a great resource. So I wanted to get that in before we got to any questions. And so here's some others. I'm a member of the National Joint Committee on Learning Disabilities, and here's LD Online, the Florida Center, University of Michigan, the Meadows Center, which is here in Texas. And so just some resources for families or individuals with dyslexia.
And we, the link that we gave you earlier, and it's also in the chat box, the bit.ly link, there's a folder in there called accommodations, and these, the PowerPoint is uploaded in there, so you'll have access to all of these resources, but I will also download the International Dyslexia Association fact sheets that are specific to accommodations and upload those in there as well. So let's shift over to Sarah Gray real quickly. Sarah Gray's been in the background monitoring our chat box. So Sarah Gray, what kind of questions do we have from our participants?
The main question really is just an add-on to what Elsa's already talked about, which is, could you address a little bit more the tension between accommodation and modification as it applies to stamina? Because sometimes it becomes a question, is it a modification if you reduce the number of questions, or is it an accommodation if you, so this, just looking at it from a stamina perspective.
Right, so no, when I was describing the modification, I was describing that the expectation was lower, but like but if I gave the example of giving multiplication instead of fractions. If I were giving the homework and let's say it was 25 fraction problems and I gave 15, that is not considered, you know, where I've had to actually modify, I accommodated, right? I didn't change the learning outcome. They're still going to be learning fractions like everyone else. They just didn't have to do as many.
Right.
So that was a good question. Thank you for asking that.
That was Suzanne.
Great, Suzanne. Great question.
And Sarah Gray, I think that leads right into another question I kind of saw about breaks during testing, because that kind of addresses that stamina issue as well. So what would those look like?
So, and that's why also you have to have very good documentation that this has kind of been how you've been operating through your academic career to get that. And, so oftentimes that might be, well, after 30 minutes, I need a break and it needs to be, 5 minutes or what have you. But that documentation is so important because I'm typically on the end where I'm writing, for test accommodations. And it is challenging now. I'm going to tell you, it is challenging to get those, especially when it's, national examinations or to get those, accommodations in place.
Anything else, Sarah Gray?
I think that's it. Elsa's done a fabulous job.
Awesome. This was nice. I hope that was helpful. We're right on time, I think. And thank you for your question. I think the handout is in there and those extra resources. And thank you for listening and inviting me. And I'm going to keep up and look and see what you have to offer every day. I can't believe that you're offering something every day this month to celebrate dyslexia awareness. So I thank you, and any questions or anything you have, I'm happy to answer those in the future. Just, send me an email or a text. So thank you.
Prior, anything else you want to say?
No, I just wanted to reiterate, Elsa, thank you so much. I loved that you mentioned the collaboration piece and how important that is to building self-advocacy. And it's not just as easy as saying that a child has these accommodations and then poof, they've got it. So thank you for highlighting that part.
Yes, we had nice discussions. It was a team effort to really bring that in.
That's a very important one for both families and teachers to understand. But I just, again, if anyone on this chat has a question for Elsa or for us, you can reach out to us on our website, nc.dyslexia.ida.org. And we would make sure that she would get that question, and then follow us as well, Instagram and the website for future coffee chat. But thank you all for your time today. And we look forward to seeing you at future coffee chats.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.